Well, hi everyone. This is one of the bigger videos I've done on the Washington Bridge, and it's really a bombshell revelation that I'm breaking to you for the first time here today. I'm recording this video on Saturday, January 17th, 2026. I had finally one of my APRA requests fulfilled by Rhode Island DOT, and there's shocking information related to the demo of the substructure for the Washington Bridge that I'm going to share with you. These documents indicate that their own consultants that were retained by Rhode Island DOT and Rhode Island DOT officials had planned to reuse the foundation for the Washington Bridge. So you heard that right, where they subsequently spent tens of millions of dollars, in excess of $40 million, and delayed the eventual start of construction for the Washington Bridge replacement by over a year because of the decision, for whatever reason, to ultimately destroy the Washington Bridge Foundation. So this was a rather momentous memo issued on March 7th, 2024 from John Price, the state bridge engineer, to Anthony Pompey, who's the project manager for the Washington Bridge. And if we go down towards the bottom here, with the complexities and difficulties of inspecting, maintaining, and repairing the bridge, linked with the magnitude and types of deficiencies documented in the reports, and reviewing all data gathered on the bridge, we conclude and recommend the replacement of the superstructure. Okay, so that was momentous, but that was back in spring of 2024. But they go on to say, as for the substructure and foundations, some reuse should be allowed with modifications to meet the current LRFD design code and load rating requirements and give a 100-year life cycle assurance. And here's the memo from their consultants that they retained to examine this question. So to go over terminology, and this actually came from RiDOT's consultants report who evaluated whether the Washington Bridge foundations could be reused. But you have the bridge deck, the girders, which are the beams that support the bridge deck. Then you have these rectangular columns, which are hidden behind these facing panels. Then you have the column base. And then you have the pier footing slash pile cap. This transfers the load from the pier to the pile foundations. And again, I want to thank Josh from Providence. He's provided numerous drone flights capturing video image of various states of demolition for the Washington Bridge. This was back in February 2025. So we can see that the outer elements of the piers have been removed, and now we see the pier columns that were internal to that structure. Zoom in here a little bit. This is the portion connecting to the Gano Street ramp. But again, these are bombshell revelations. This memo was issued by VHB, and they worked jointly with their subconsultant GZA to evaluate whether the piers and foundations could be reused for the Westbound Washington Bridge. And this memo was dated March 8th, 2024, so a day after RiDOT's memo. At the beginning, this document introduction states, at the request of Rhode Island Department of Transportation, VHB is working with subconsultant GZA to evaluate the potential reuse of Bridge 700 pile supported structures, presuming a complete superstructure replacement. So they made some basic assumptions, starting with the configuration of the new superstructure, similar to what was there before. They assumed a steel plate girder superstructure, which is what Walsh is going to end up constructing, as it turns out. And then they get into discussion of the foundation piles. These were installed in the late 1960s as part of the new construction at the time for the Westbound Washington Bridge. These are HP 14 by 89 steel pile, and they were roughly 100 foot in length. They extended all the way to bedrock. And I'll draw your attention to these concluding statements here. Piles at piers 1 through 5 and piers 8 through 13 have sufficient capacity for reuse. Piles at piers 6 and 7 may require new supplemental piles unless higher capacities of the existing piles can be justified. Pier footings require strengthening or supplemental load transfer footings unless sufficient capacity can be justified with rigorous structural analysis and footing condition verification. And they go on to talk about the columns. Although the concrete pier columns have some service life remaining, the current condition of substandard reinforcement detailing does not ensure these columns can meet the project goals without modifications. If it is confirmed that the pier footings require strengthening, replacing the existing columns eases different solutions for footing strengthening. New columns would be favored for these reasons. So these internal columns that you saw exposed during the February 5th, 2025 drone flight was recommended to be replaced, but everything else below that could have been reused. So that's massive. Both RiDOT and their consultant said that significant portions of the existing bridge foundations for the Washington Bridge could be reused. So what happened from beginning of March to the end of April 2024? That's when RiDOT issues their request for proposal for a design build replacement for the Washington Bridge. This is the one that failed to get any bidders. And the result is it's delayed the project for an eventual completion of a replacement bridge by over a year. That's all been swept under the rug by Rhode Island state officials by saying, hey, we've got a great contractor on board now. Forget the year delay that resulted from this muddled request for a proposal. But interestingly, in this document, the specification, they said that the existing foundations could not be reused and that the new foundations had to be at that same location. So that put off would be proposers. It was like, well, how do we do this? And didn't make a lot of sense to people. So again, how did they go from their memos, the RIDOT memo from John Price, as well as the memo from VHB saying that significant portions of the foundation could and should be reused to, oh yeah, you can't reuse it now. Well, I asked for all documentation from RIDOT for technical evaluation for the reuse of existing Washington Bridge foundations, and those are the two documents I got. So apparently, there were no further evaluations. This was someone at RiDOT management deciding, hey, let's just go ahead and replace all the foundations, which is extremely costly and added a full year to the eventual replacement for the Washington Bridge. Now, after the failure of Rhode Island DOT to obtain any proposals for a replacement design build project, they went out and asked consultants and contractors, hey, please respond to our request for information and give us your thoughts as to why you didn't propose on this. And GZA, again, they were working with VHB in evaluating the substructure reuse and was part of that memo issued in early March 2024. They responded by saying, our response is going to focus on the foundation reuse for the Washington Bridge. So I'll draw your attention to the middle of this page. As outlined above, the foundations, especially the ones in the water, pose the highest risk for the project. To avoid many of these potential problems, RIDOT should reconsider reusing the existing foundations. This was the decision that was made for the adjacent Washington Bridge, number 200. That bridge was rebuilt in 2008 and reused the 1920s era timber pile that only extend about 40 feet into the channel. They don't go 100 feet to bedrock and are made of steel like the ones on the Westbound Washington Bridge. But I'll continue. And the upstream Henderson Bridge. Bridge 200 is constructed on more than 1,000 timber piles, and the Henderson Bridge is built on hundreds of similar steel H piles, similar to the Westbound Washington Bridge that was constructed in the late 1960s. This is a common practice, and FHWA has guidelines outlining such procedures. So there was a total of 11 responses to this request for information. And GZA is the only one that addressed the reuse of existing Westbound Bridge foundations one way or the other. Of course, they advocated for reuse. So for some reason, Rhode Island DOT officials ignored the advice of their consultants to consider reuse of the foundations. They ignored the advice in this response to their request for information about foundation reuse. We don't know what was in the Kiewit alternative technical concept proposal. I submitted an APA request, and just this week, I was told that RIDOT considered that information to be privileged. So I'd be curious how Kiewit's proposal addressed potential foundation reuse. But as we know, RIDOT continued on the path. In June of 2024, they issued the contract for the superstructure demolition to Aetna Vinagro for over $45 million. And then in October 2024, they issued a sole source contract to Aetna Vinagro for the demolition of the substructure. That is, to not reuse the existing foundations to the tune of $38,410,000. And there's been additional money that was spent through various change orders issued by RiDOT to Etna Vinagro. Now, I have to say, early on when I was doing videos about this project, I thought it made sense to use new foundations. That's common in the Midwest where I practice. And Laszlo Sigman, he's written numerous editorials that were published in the Providence Journal. He reached out to me pretty early on in the course of me producing these videos and was an advocate for foundation reuse. And it took me some time to come around to his way of thinking, but that was based on additional research and finding out that the existing eastbound Washington Bridge is on timber pile foundations that were reused in 2008, that the Henderson Bridge, which had similar foundations to the westbound Washington Bridge, had their foundations reused during this recent reconstruction that was completed in 2023. And so I would say he's been fully vindicated here. I mean, just think about it. Here's some footage from back in November 2025. Again, Josh from Providence provided it to me. But you have 6 lanes of traffic on the eastbound Washington Bridge. And this bridge is entirely supported by pile foundations that were installed in the late 1920s. So again, RIDOT's decision to replace the substructure for the Washington Bridge has resulted in significant delays to the eventual completion of a replacement bridge. I sent one of my staffers to the Washington Bridge site in early January, on January 8th and 9th, 2026, and we saw that their demo activities were still ongoing, contrary to what Governor McKee announced on December 5th, 2025, touting that the demo work had been completed ahead of schedule. So you can see Vinagro's barge with the excavator and the clamshell attachment still removing debris from the demolition from the Seekonk River. So it remains to be seen to what extent, if any, Walsh will be delayed in the start of their work for installing a replacement bridge here. I'm on the lookout for that potential change order. So we're talking about in excess of $40 million to demo the substructure of the Washington Bridge, a additional delay in over a year to the eventual replacement bridge project, and then the cost in tens of millions of dollars for installing new foundations instead of reusing the existing foundations. So I think Rhode Island DOT has a lot of explaining to do here. Why did they ignore their consultants' advice to reuse the existing foundations? I asked for all technical information involving the evaluation of foundation reuse, and they produced these 2 documents. These project decisions, in my opinion, should be made on the basis of sound engineering practice. What was the basis for them deciding to go ahead and remove the existing foundations for the Washington Bridge and have to put in new ones? I'm going to stay on this story, but I hope local media extensively follows up on my breaking news here. It's just a fundamental example here of what I consider to be mismanagement of taxpayer dollars by Rhode Island DOT, and it's costing the traveling public unnecessary delays for an eventual replacement bridge project, in my opinion. So, with that, I have a few book recommendations for you. Perfect stories, gothic horror for those long, cold winter nights. The first is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. The book was written over 200 years ago and it's fantastic. In fact, I like it better than the movies. As much as I love the movies, the book's even better. It's the original mess around and find out saga. Also, I want to recommend Phantom of the Opera. That was a very interesting book. I like the setting of the Paris Opera House. I've never seen the movie or the play, but I really enjoyed the book. And then my all-time favorite gothic horror novel is Bram Stoker's Dracula. This is in my top 10 favorite novels. Very interesting scene setting, rich story, great characters. Absolutely loved it. If you want to check out any of these books, I've got links in the description. And with that, I want to send a shout out to those of you who've contributed to Buy Me a Coffee. There was an outpouring of contributions following my last video talking about the ongoing demolition work, even though it was supposed to be done. I sent a staffer out there and many of you contributed to help defray my expenses associated with those travel costs, as well as the ongoing expenses I have filing these APRA public records requests that RiDOT more often than not is now charging me for. So again, I appreciate that support. I also want to thank the channel members who typically preview these videos 1 or more days in advance. And also want to thank those of you who've contributed to Super Thanks, additional great ways to support the channel. So I'll continue following the Washington Bridge saga. I've got many more pending APA requests that I hope they fulfill here soon. So stay tuned, everyone.